apparently 7,000 people left Melbourne proper to go down to Port Melbourne, about 4 miles out of Melbourne on the day, to see the Shenandoah at that stage at anchor. 7,000 people was the largest amount of people that could possibly be shown. Almost 10% of Melbourne's population came down to look. That would have been equivalent to the amount of people who came to see the Beatles in 1964, or the people who came to see Taylor Swift, who was here last month.
This program is a video presentation of the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia. Please consider making a monetary gift to support our efforts to bring Civil War history to viewers like you. Visit CWRTDC.org to learn how.
Good evening to our roundtable members and our online guests. I believe we have 4 people from Australia online. This is our premiere presentation, as it's our first Zoom lecture given from south of the equator. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Barry Crompton of Melbourne, Australia. Barry graciously agreed to pitch hit for our scheduled speaker who was called out of country. A personal thank you, Barry, for being our slogger tonight. That is a cricket term. My friendship with Barry dates to 2007, when I accompanied my wife, Jean, on an academic trip to Australia to the University of Melbourne. Finding that there was an active Civil War roundtable in Melbourne, I pitched the possibility of giving a talk there on Civil War medicine. Barry was my contact and he warmly welcomed me. My presentation was well received, with pint following pint at the Melbourne Civil War Roundtable's clubhouse, the Retreat Hotel. My humble offer to talk was greatly repaid by Barry. He took me in tow and showed me the many Civil War sites and locations in Melbourne, to my surprise. Most were about the rebel raider, the CSS Shenandoah, and a refit there in the winter of early '65. Since then, Barry has been one of my valued instructors on many things Civil War and Australian. We share interests in stamp collecting as well. Barry is an avid collector of American Civil War related stamps, letters, patriotic and first day covers. He possesses the largest collection of American Civil War books, and he related 27 bookshelves of books, magazines, and pamphlets in the Southern Hemisphere in his Archer Civil War Library. He's the past editor of and ongoing contributor to the Civil War Roundtable of Australia's newsletter, and the author of its very distinctive, often humorous Barry Graham Dispatches. Barry was born and raised in Melbourne and worked in advertising and accounts for over 25 years for a Melbourne newspaper, The Age. No, he never worked for Rupert Murdoch. Barry, like many of us, got his American Civil War bug reading Bruce Catton in his youth. I'm excited to hear his talk tonight to Catton's Own, the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia. Now, live from down under, my good mate, Barry Crompton.
Thank you, Kurt. Thank you, Mick. It's very appreciative of you allowing me the time and effort to go through the links between Australia and the American Civil War. We have a shared history that goes back many years, and Australia and America are allies in a lot of ways. The more that I learn, the more that I find out that these just continue over the years. The amount of information that we find is incredibly satisfying to be able to record and to learn as we go along our thing. As I said many years ago when I delivered a talk to the Civil War Roundtable of Atlanta, I said that the reason of Australia's finding also had a lot of doings with America. Captain James Cook, the British explorer, discovered Australia for England in 1770, and in 1788, 18 years later, as I said to the Atlanta Round Table, due to the fact that England could no longer send any more convicts to Georgia because of the American Revolution, they had to send them somewhere. They thought that they'll send them as far away as they possibly could. And in 1788, the first ship of convicts settled in Sydney, Australia. Due to the War of Independence and later the War of 1812, Australia was founded for convicts. There were 5 major settlements in the years going past it. Australia and America, as such, in the beginning, didn't really have a great deal of links because Britain decided that it wanted to be set apart from America, and as such, there wasn't a lot of trade going on. However, in 1835, Charles Wilkes, in command of the South Sea Expedition, travelled to Sydney, Australia to refit and to refuel. Charles Wilkes, of course, later was the commander of the USS San Jacinto, captured the Trent, which was ferrying the Confederate diplomats to England and France in 1861. The Trent affair became much of a point. So we'll show another naval commander, David D. Porter, who also came to Australia before the war. As we went along, the gold rush in California in 1849 brought forth huge amounts of people to the west coast of America. Some travelled from Sydney, Australia, which was the major area of population at that time. There was a group called the Wild Men of Sydney who supposedly created havoc around San Francisco and the gold mines. And several of the Australians remained in California. Two of the Irishmen in the 1849 uprising in Ireland were also sent to Australia and managed to escape Tasmania, then called Van Diemen's Land, after the Dutch explorer. John Mitchell Sr. became an editorial newspaper man in Knoxville, Tennessee, and then moved to Richmond, Virginia, where he was editor of the Richmond Examiner. His 3 sons all served in the Civil War. One was at the Battle of Gettysburg in the 1st Virginia Infantry. John C. Mitchell served in Charleston, South Carolina, and was killed at Fort Sumter in 1864, 1863, I think, during the bombardment from the United States forces into Charleston. The other member of that team of Irishmen who were transported to Australia was of the celebrated Francis Scott Key's son, who was involved in the divorce of Dan Sickles and his wife. Dan Sickles shot Key, of course, and went on trial, and it was the first case that they used of self-defense through legal matters pertaining to insanity at the time. Of course, Thomas Francis Meagher later became commanding general of the New York Irish Brigade, promoted to Major General after Gettysburg, when the Irish Brigade was no longer a fit area to be involved in battle. He became the acting governor of Montana Territory. Mysteriously either fell over or was shot, a bushwhacker, and drowned in the river. As we continued going through, after the 1849 discovery of gold in California, shortly after that, early 1850s, they found gold, first in New South Wales near Sydney, and secondly in Victoria near Melbourne. And it became the biggest gold rush of the time. By the time of the Civil War, the gold rush had made Melbourne, Australia, the biggest city in the Southern Hemisphere with about 100,000 people. People from all over the world trekked into Melbourne to find gold. Several did, several didn't. And with the amount of people in Australia, should see a theatrical crowds, of course, came to Australia to make money. One of the ones that sailed out of San Francisco, headed directly for Melbourne and Sydney, was a theatrical troupe that included Edwin Booth, actor of John Wilkes, and Laura Keane, who was, of course, on the stage in Ford's Theatre when Lincoln was shot. There continued to be a number of theatrical people who came here, including Joseph Jefferson, who was the leading actor of the time. Another one, please, Kurt, was General Tom Thumb and his wife. They toured Australia slightly after the war. Of course, General Tom Thumb was married during the Civil War to his wife and was presented to Lincoln in the White House. As we continued in the gold rushes, next was a gentleman by the name of Freeman Cobb, who came from Connecticut. He managed to find his own way of making money, and Freeman Cobb had the company Cobb & Co. Coaches, which imported the American Conestoga coaches because they were the most suitable for the Australian landscape. There was a series of TV which ran for 2 years, I think, in the early 1960s, and they imported Peter Graves, American actor who later became famous in Mission Impossible. Of course, Peter Graves played Freeman Cobb as a stagecoach driver in that series. Freeman Cobb, during the Civil War, returned to Connecticut and served in the state legislative council. Charles Handley was another one of the Australians who settled in America. He went to Oregon and during the Civil War was included in the 1st Oregon Volunteers. Although they didn't see service as such, there were many Australian men, probably up to a dozen, who served in California regiments and Oregon regiments, Washington Territory regiments. So there's an awful lot of history in that. Although they weren't actually served, they were counted as Civil War veterans, and they continued in that way. As we go along, the visit of the CSS Shenandoah was the biggest thing that hit Melbourne, Australia in a long, long time. It was bought by Confederate purchasing agents in England, sailed out of England, rendezvoused off the coast of Spain in the Mediterranean, got supplied, was renamed from the Sea King to the Shenandoah, continued on its way south through the Atlantic Ocean, and then hit the Roaring Forties, which is the major Gulf Stream from the Atlantic Ocean through to Australia. It arrived in Melbourne on the 25th of January 1865. It had been required to post letters and correspondence to the Confederate authorities back to England. Of course, there was no correspondence between the Confederacy and Australia as such, and the only way that you could get letters from the Confederacy, in fact even the Union, was to go via England, get them onto a mail packet, send them to Australia. The Shenandoah required repairs, it required men. It sailed into Melbourne's harbour on the 25th of January and left on the 18th of February. 23 days later, it included 42 additional members of its crew who had been signed on in Melbourne. Only one of those 42 was actually Melbourne-born or Australian-born. The remainder of the crew had come from ships that had docked in Melbourne because of the gold rush from all around the world. The Shenandoah continued on its way for another 10 months or so. And the Shenandoah, the only known photograph of the ship taken in Melbourne, Australia, as it was being repaired in dry dock at one of Melbourne's suburbs, Williamstown, with the men working on the side of the ship. We've also got photographs of the Shenandoah officers that were taken at the time. They were dined heartily. They were given access to the Melbourne Cricket Club. They were given access to the Melbourne Club, which was full of Melbourne's gentry. They were shown around Melbourne. One of the officers was taken down to the beach side a couple of miles from my place or so and given the best part of open freedom. They were shown to the theatres, they were shown around and given a wonderful time by the Melbourne locals. Apparently 7,000 people left Melbourne proper to go down to Port Melbourne, about 4 miles out of Melbourne on the bay, to see the Shenandoah at that stage at anchor. 7,000 people was the largest amount of people that could possibly be shown. Almost 10% of Melbourne's population came down to look. That would have been equivalent to the amount of people who came to see the Beatles in 1964, or the people who came to see Taylor Swift, who was here last month. The Shenandoah continued on its way. It later found out from a captured British vessel that the Civil War had ended, and they found that they could either go back to Melbourne to surrender, go to South Africa, or they decided that the best way was to go back to England. It arrived in Liverpool, England in November 1865 and surrendered, the last Confederate flag to be flying. The 42 men on board that had been recruited in Melbourne, about half a dozen of them finally made their way back to Melbourne because they thought it was such a good place to live in, including the one Australian participant who continued in Melbourne for the next 40 years till he died and is buried in the Melbourne General Cemetery. Captain Waddell from North Carolina was in charge of the Shenandoah. Captain Waddell was in his 40s when he arrived here. After the ship surrendered, he was able to get back to America in the 1870s, became Commandant of the US Naval Academy at Annapolis, also sailed ships between California and the Nicaraguan Mexican coastway, died in Annapolis and is buried there. The Civil War Roundtable of Australia is delighted that it has 5 original photographs of Waddell and 4 of his officers that were taken by a photography studio in Melbourne. Considerably worthy of our attention, and of course we're delighted to have them available to the world. Post-war, there were a number of people again who found their way to Australia in the theatrical side of the world. One of them was a producer and a theatre manager by the name of J.C. Williamson, who was only 15 at the time of the Civil War. His mother wouldn't allow him to participate in the war, said he was too young. So slightly after that, Williamson decided that he would come to Australia. He made bucket loads of money by doing Gilbert and Sullivan shows in Australia, HMS Pinafore, the Mikado, and many others. Of course, the links between Gilbert and Sullivan and Australia and America. John Ford, the ex-manager of Ford's Theatre in Washington, was the first person to put on Gilbert and Sullivan plays in New York City when he placed the initial theatrical performances of The Pirates of Penzance in New York City. The gentleman pictured is Francis Bates. He and his wife came to Australia. He had served as a private in the 3rd Georgia Infantry. He was travelling around the southern states, made his name, came to Australia, performed in Melbourne, and for some unknown reason, he was waylaid in a suburb of Melbourne and was found dead in the streets. He was buried in the Melbourne General Cemetery, along with several other Civil War people who we have found later on. And there were a number of people who turned up to Melbourne to do theatrical shows and lectures. Charles Dickens made a name for himself in Australia by performing lectures, as did Mark Twain. Henry Morton Stanley, who was the man who found Dr. Livingstone in the deepest, darkest past of Africa. Henry Stanley, of course, had been a member of an Arkansas regiment, I think the 6th Arkansas, and had served at the Battle of Shiloh, was captured, sent to a northern prison in Illinois, decided that he would sign the Oath of Allegiance, and Henry Morton Stanley became an Illinois soldier. Didn't like that after a number of months or so and turned his attention and then served in the United States Navy during the war. Always amazes me that Henry Morton Stanley had such an incredibly interesting life after the war. Of course, he became a journalist for one of the New York newspapers where he was sent on assignment to find Dr. Livingston. Livingston's son, of course, also served in the Civil War where he died. This is Her Majesty's Victorian ship Cerberus, which the Victorian government, when they found that Melbourne didn't have any defences as such, they bought the Cerberus from England 1866, the year after the war. The Cerberus hugged the coast of Europe and Africa, wound up in Australia 1867, and served in the Victorian Navy for the next 40 years. This is the Cerberus at dock in Williamstown, where the Shenandoah had been. For 40 years, the Cerberus remained available on duty till it was finally found just prior to World War One that it was no longer suitable for usefulness and was sunk as a breakwater about 5 miles from my place. You can still go and look at the Cerberus's top hull where the revolving turrets are. It's no longer safe to be able to go out there and swim around it, and it's a rust bucket after all of these years. But the Cerberus had a lot of interest. They also found that they didn't have the facilities to propel either more American incursions or from Russia, so they bought Armstrong cannon from England as well. The Armstrong cannons, of course, were around America during the war, and we still have Armstrong cannons looking out across our bay in Melbourne. James Morris Morgan became United States consul in the 1880s. He had been captain of the CSS Georgia, and when Reconstruction ended, the ex-Confederate officials were able to serve again. He was one of the people who was given the role of consul in the 1880s with his wife. The consul in Melbourne during the time of the Shenandoah's arrival in Melbourne was a gentleman named William Blanchard, who had been a lawyer in Washington. He was one of the two proprietors of the newspaper, The National Era, in the early 1850s. That was the first newspaper to print by chapter the Uncle Tom's Cabin. And after that, of course, it came out in book format and made Harriet Beecher Stowe an absolute fortune. James Morris Morgan was one of a number of consuls from the Confederacy who would have served, including John Singleton Mosby, who was the consul in Hong Kong when General Grant visited Asia in the 1880s after his presidency. Suffice to say that you could make money by publishing books. James Morris Morgan wrote his exploits as a Confederate reefer during the Civil War, as did several of the Shenandoah officers after the war, the first one being the Cruise of the Shenandoah by its officer Cornelius Hunt, that was published the year after the war as well. The Civil War consul at the time, William Blanchard, as I said, he was given the role by Abraham Lincoln, assumedly for giving some support to getting the election over the line. And William Blanchard received $5,000 per year as consul in Melbourne. That was the second highest amount in the Asian Pacific area, only beaten by China, which would have had more importance in the early days of the war. But William Blanchard, as consul, was an angry man who decided that he would leave his life behind in Washington for the 4 years that he was posted here, as with his children. Because of the role of the Shenandoah being outfitted and the 42 men who served on board when the United States decided in the early 1870s to charge Great Britain for its role in the Civil War. The Alabama claims gave about 15 million American dollars because of damages. Most of that was due to the Alabama's tour around, but $3.5 million was due to the Shenandoah being in Melbourne. But I think that England decided that it would give the money to the United States and allow the English-American relationship to recuperate from the Alabama claims onwards. The two have been allies for a long, long time. We had a lot of people who came here after the war, and in the 1980s, there was a newspaper article that appeared in something that I was later involved with, which was requiring information on Civil War veterans who came to Australia. At that stage, we found out that three brothers who had served in Massachusetts and New York regiments came to Australia, where they were buried, and an ex-World War II American pilot who later became a pilot for the Australian airline Qantas was living in Sydney, Australia with his wife and children or so, and we found out in the early 1980s that he was searching for Civil War veterans. Our Australian Roundtable and several other people became involved in the hunt, and we found out now, 40 years later, that there's about between 300 and 400 Civil War veterans who came to Australia. With this involvement, we began to participate in Memorial Day services in Melbourne and Sydney, which we have doing every year other than the COVID virus times, and we continue to participate. This is an illustration from a man named Colonel Austin, the American sharpshooter, also known as Ike Smith, who was a veteran of the Civil War who toured and made money during the 1870s, 1880s, when there was good money to be had. As we kept on saying, a number of people with Civil War links continued to travel through Australia, making money from the theatrical times, as we've said before. The next one, the highest ranking ex-Civil War veteran who turned up here was a man called James Campbell, who was a colonel in a New York artillery regiment. He settled in Melbourne and did quite well. Fortunately, he went to the Melbourne City Baths, which was a public bathing area where you could get refreshed for a reasonable fee. And while he was there, he was actually scalded by the hot water and as a result died. One of the many that we found located in the Melbourne cemeteries or so. Another one of the people who came here was a German business name, Adolf Brockhoff, served in a New York infantry regiment for some time. He came to Melbourne after the war, began a company that was producing cookies and made such an amount of money. He was able to build a mansion in Melbourne. Is also buried here in one of our cemeteries. His great-great-granddaughter participated in the Olympic Games during the winter in the last two seasons and didn't win medals, but got very close to it. Continuing on, the American government through Veterans Affairs has been very good to us over the years, and by being able to participate in research with us. This is one of the American veterans buried in a cemetery outside Melbourne that was given the traditional veteran headstone as was done in the days. The ones that are now given grave markers are the typical ones or so that we see. This is another one in a Melbourne cemetery or so. For some reason, the researcher who was a part of the American Civil War Roundtable of Queensland decided that he would put the Roundtable of Queensland's name on the grave markers, which we weren't doing in Melbourne, but when they were laid in the ground and given the suitable honours or so, that was how we were able to remember their names. And the veterans, as I said, Adolf Brockhoff made his money from making cookies. Another one was Edwin Brady, who had also served in a New York regiment. He made his name writing books, and had a couple published or so, and this was an Australian philatelic cover for a pre-stamped envelope made in the 1990s or so with his name on it. So they continued to make money. There's an awful lot of involvement there. 1908, President Theodore Roosevelt decided that he would show the Great White Fleet around the world. They sailed out of San Francisco, traveled around the world, going into various harbors. And as it happened, they traveled into Melbourne, anchored at the same place where the Shenandoah had been. And this is going up Collins Street, Melbourne, which is one of the main thoroughfares. And one of the buildings on the right-hand side is actually the Melbourne Club, where the Shenandoah officers had been entertained at dinner. The sailors from the US vessels marched 4 miles from Melbourne's port through the streets of Melbourne to what was then the exhibition building, which was another one of Melbourne's highlights or so, as we know from the 1850s onwards and the 1876 centennial through to the 1900s. Very many world's expositions and world's fairs were held around the world, including America. The Great White Fleet continued on its way, showing America's might. And at that stage, of course, we were still a few years from World War One, but Australia and America had a great friendship, which has continued going through. The next, Theodore Penlin, who was the Grand Army of the Republic's Commander-in-Chief, he visited Queensland, Australia in the 1920s or so, when he was still able to get around or so. And it's surprising that the Grand Army of the Republic, of course, had several ways and means of being able to distribute its talents around the world. We haven't seen a Grand Army post in Australia, but there was something similar in England. Through the ability to do research in the 1880s, there was a list of veterans who were receiving pensions, and that included several listing their residences in Australia. And similarly, in 1901, another listing of Civil War veterans receiving pensions gave us about a dozen who were on pensions sent to Australia. In the 1980s, of course, as we began getting involved with Civil War veterans and their arrival in Australia, prior to the arrival of the internet and such, the only way that we could do our research was to either write letters to America, to Veterans Affairs and the National Archives, and then wait for responses, or else, as I found out, it was easier to go and buy books. And consequently, I was able to buy a set of the official records. I was buying up state rosters as far as I could, 12 volumes of Ohio regiments, 8 volumes of Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, as much as I possibly could. Consequently, I developed a database, again prior to the internet, of 8 million names, which is as much as probably 2 names from each, either from the record of service that the National Archives had, or else from the individual state archives, as well as Grand Army annual reports, cemetery reports, listings of the soldiers' homes, and the pension records. The 8 million names represents, as close as possible, at least 2 references for each soldier. And prior to the internet in the 1990s, that was the only way that we could get information suitably available. The books are now, of course, available via such places as Internet Archive and sitting in my library, unloved, unwanted, unwashed. Continue. Williamstown, the suburb of Melbourne, across the bay from Melbourne, the Armstrong cannons are there still, not doing any damage, fortunately, but in 2015, for the 150th anniversary of the Shenandoah's arrival, we put on an exhibition at Williamstown, which was going to give us some amount of ability to show what we had, which was always handy. And for that, we are quite happy for the involvement of the US government, the local and the state authorities to be involved. One more slide, and that'll about do it now. is a gentleman that I came across a little while ago. This came on eBay a couple of weeks ago, and I bought it up slightly more than I wanted to really pay. But first and only time I've actually seen this carte de visite taken during the war of a New York officer by the name of Henry Olcott. Henry was involved early in the war investigating the theft companies who were making fraudulent claims, charging more than they should have done during the Civil War. And he served as an adjunct to the War Department, going through companies, making sure that they weren't charging more than they should have been doing. And at the time of the Lincoln assassination, he was asked to do some investigative work for the people involved in the association, who eventually found John Wilkes Booth and his accomplices. Henry Olcott became a believer in one of the more unusual themes of religion post-war, and he and a friend became the founders of Theosophical Society, which had a lot of Indian themes about it. He went to India in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, settled there for a while, and then settled in Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. As a part of the Theosophical Society, they set up branches in Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, and Brisbane, as far as we can tell. And he made at least 2 tours of Australia, 1891 and 1897. He died in Ceylon, and he had a stamp issued by Ceylon in 1968 for the 60th anniversary of his death. A stamp, Colonel H.S. Olcott, United States Army, not Navy. Slight problem there, but as such. So that's the end of the slideshow as such. I've done about 40 minutes and delighted to answer any questions that people might have now.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, Barry. That was wonderful. So much to ask about, but let me start off there. Question I have is, now that I see the Shenandoah, I thought it was bigger than it was. I think you may have answered this, but how many were in the crew, total members of the crew?
It had half a dozen officers from America, slightly more maybe. It required a crew of 70 to 80. It only had about half of that, mainly picked up from originally being on the crew when it was the Sea King from England, but it also joined people who were captured, the whaling vessels that came to the prizes of the Shenandoah, and rather than go back to America, they decided to jump on board and became crew members. It was about 270 feet long, I think. It needed the crew members, of course, to do its work. It had a propeller and an engine as well as sails, so it was able to do both. Very fast vessel, and it was able to overtake the slower whaling vessels. It damaged enough of them or sunk, or was able to keep some of them also to transfer prisoners, of course, and managed to do a lot of the business. Of course, the problem with the New England whaling fleet, after the war, it was reduced to about 1/10 of what it was before the war, but that was also due to the ability to get oil from the oil fields of Pennsylvania and Ohio. So the reliance of whale oil for lighting and other matters or so wasn't quite as much as it needed to do after that.
So a crew of 70 or 80, that would be pretty packed then. It was pretty tight.
It certainly was. Fortunately enough, the Shenandoah only lost one man during its entire cruise around the world, and that was a man who got sick and died. He was supposedly had served in a Louisiana regiment, but we're not particularly sure of that because he probably used a false name. So, and a lot of the people who, when they surrendered in Liverpool after the war, they used false names and said that they were English citizens, so they weren't available to be prosecuted.
Okay, so that was, I did see the smokestack. Was that coal or whale oil?
Mostly coal or so. They had to go into Melbourne to refuel. They needed to get the messages. There was no telegraph, of course, from England to Australia, so they needed to send out mail. They also needed coaling, and during one of the storms, the propeller had been damaged, which was why the ship was put into dry dock.
Okay, and my last question before I open it up to others is, you mentioned how it was pretty attractive, all those people going to see it. Why that ship over any other ship? Why was that one so attractive?
Obviously, during the Civil War, the news was arriving in Australia 3 or 6 months after the war. They'd only found out in January 1865 or so that the Petersburg campaign had started, or the Overland campaign. There was a lot of interest in the Civil War, either due to American people who were living here, or else I don't think of anything of that importance. They thought it might have been the CSS Alabama who had turned up, but no, it was the Shenandoah. Mick has been doing research, which I really found interesting. The USS Kearsarge, the opposite to the Alabama, turned up in Sydney's harbour in 1867, 1868. That made a lot of news in that time as well to the Sydney people.
All right, thank you. I see John's got his hand up. Let me just go start with Jean Montgomery, though, because this is a great segue about the attractiveness. And Jean, if you want to open your mic and ask it, but she says a lot of people headed west to the Western U.S. looking for new opportunities after the war. So she's asked, what do you think it was that motivated these former military people to go even farther west, all the way to Australia?
It's surprising so far, out of the 300 to 500 people that we know who had served in the Civil War, and the ones that we're still finding, about 90% of those were Union veterans. Certain amounts, certainly larger than represented. A lot of them had been in the US Navy. Of course, they were seagoing men who travelled around the world and found that they could live in Melbourne very attractively, so that there is a lot of interest in the US Navy. We also found out, of course, that with the pensions then becoming available, that it was easy to go around the world and to get a pension from the government and have it sent to Australia via the US consuls in Melbourne. We haven't found as many Confederates at this stage because it would have been difficult with Reconstruction for as many people in the South to even get money to afford to travel, and also the fact that the pension records of Confederate veterans is nowhere near as good as those are in Veterans Affairs. We know of only one Australian man who served in the Civil War, who had actually gone to the United States for the war. He was a Tasmanian-born man who came from a very wealthy family, and he was in England serving with the British Army when the war broke out. He resigned from the British Army, made his way to Charleston, South Carolina, and joined Hampton's Legion, served the 4 years of the war, was surrendered, and remarkably came back to Australia, where he went back to his family, was not forgiven for what he had done, and made his way to Queensland, up the top of Australia, where he became a member of the Queensland Mounted Police. For some reason, he left that job. We think he may have possibly gone to the Philippines and may be possibly buried on a US Army base in the Philippines in the early 1900s.
Thank you for that answer. So let's see, I see, John, you had a question, or you raised your hand there.
Okay. Barry, you know I was not going to let you get away without asking you a few questions. Okay. For the benefit of everybody, just a quick overview of a couple of situations in Australia during the war. First of all, most people are going to be hearing about Sydney and Melbourne. Okay. How was Australia populated at that time? With Melbourne, Sydney, they were the two dominant populated areas. What about the rest of Australia? Were there any population areas of note that would have been aware of the Civil War?
We have found Civil War veterans in all of the states of Australia. The two biggest ones, as I said, Sydney and Melbourne, were about the same size, but Brisbane in Queensland, Adelaide in South Australia, Hobart in Tasmania, Perth in Western Australia were also 50,000 people. Sydney with 100,000 and Melbourne with 100,000 were certainly the largest ones of the time. Sydney was founded by convicts, Brisbane in Queensland, convicts, Hobart also by convicts. Adelaide in 1835 had convict population. Perth being on the other side of Australia, considering that Australia is the same size roughly as America, 3,000 miles across from Melbourne to Perth. No telegraphs, no trains. The only way to get around was by ship in those days.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, the next one, I just finished reading a work called The World on Fire, and it focused on UK and American Civil War relations. And it was very fascinating to read some of the accounts about how certain newspapers in England took on the pro-Union and the pro-Confederate stance. What about the press in Australia?
Quite an unusual question, but quite relevant. I found out only a number of years ago. I'm fifth generation English. My great-great-grandfather came out from England to Australia in 1863. He came from Manchester, which was then involved with cotton famine, and due to the lack of work, no idea how he got the money, but he, his wife and young son traveled on the Great Western, I think one of the big vessels in a day, and arrived in Melbourne in the middle of 1863, and then went into Ballarat, where the gold rush was then performing. There were three local daily Melbourne newspapers. Two of them were pro-Confederate, one was pro-Union. There was only one major newspaper that I will say in Sydney at the time, the Sydney Morning Herald, which is still financing. The Melbourne Age newspaper that I became a member of, it was begun in the 1850s during the gold rush by a Scotsman, David Syme, who was interested in nationalism and was available gave a fairly reasonable account of the Shenandoah's trip to Melbourne and how the officers were treated.
And my last question for you, you touched on the magic word I was about to ask, but for the background, on one of the two trips I made down under, you and several of the other members of the roundtable took me to Ballarat. And I was very, very impressed with that, particularly learning about the history of the uprising, the rebellion against British authority. So my question was, from your research, okay, how did what happened at Ballarat in any way, shape, or form affect Australian views of looking at the American Civil War?
Again, it's surprising the amount of links between Australia, America, and of course England also. In the early 1850s, the Victorian government, at that stage we were all colonies, we didn't become an Australian Commonwealth until 1901, but in the early 1850s, the authorities decided that they would require each of the gold miners to pay a mining license, whether you made any money or not. I think it was something like £1 a license. The gold miners didn't like that idea, and they decided to rebel against the imposition of the licenses. And at Ballarat, which is about 100 miles from Melbourne, they decided to hold a meeting where they became a part of a movement, Eureka, which was led by an Irishman by the name of Peter Layla. Funny enough, Peter Layla had a brother who served in the Iron Brigade in the war. For some unknown reason, I don't know why, enlisted in February 1864 at the age of 40, served for 3 months and was killed at the Battle of the Wilderness 3 months later, in May 1864. Peter Layla became a member of the state parliament later on. The Layla family in Ireland had another 3 brothers who served in American business interests or so, but and of course the miners in their rebellion had their own flag, which they called the Southern Cross, because when you look up in the skies, in the night skies in Australia, you see the Southern Cross constellation or so, and of course the Southern Cross became the Confederate flag.
Okay, many thanks for the back and forth, the sharing of information. I think to use the phrase that I picked up from the visit, fair dinkum.
Thank you,
Fair,
James.
fair dinkum for sure.
Now, we do have a question from I think it's from Jeff, but along those lines, what do you recommend is the best book on the CSS Shenandoah?
One of our members wrote a book that was released in the early 2000s of the officers off the Shenandoah, published by the University of Florida Press by Angus Curry, I think his name is, and that's about 500 pages of a huge amount of research done on the officers themselves of the Shenandoah, which is remarkably good. But then in 2015, a book came out that was produced by the United States Naval Press at Annapolis by Dwight Hughes, a biography of the Shenandoah. And that is also another one of the books. There's been about a dozen books on the Shenandoah. Most of them use the same reference material. So Dwight Hughes was able to dig into a lot of work or so, and that's extremely interesting.
Gene was asking about, no, Jeff Joyce, I'm sorry. Are there Civil War reenactors in Australia? If so, is there an umbrella organization with a Facebook page or website?
There is a group of Civil War reenactors. We haven't been, I'll say they haven't been as active in recent years. We're all getting older, we're all getting more complicated. The Australian firearm laws are now very much more complicated than they were 50 years ago. And due to some gun violence in the 1990s, they passed legislation in the Australian government that people require to have gun licenses, and it's much more complicated nowadays. There are reenactors. There's a group called the Shenandoah Crew who are still reasonably involved or so, but I don't think that there's the enthusiasm for the reenacting that there used to be. And with the outbreak of COVID, a lot of those activities have been curtailed.
Okay, thank you. I've spotlighted Dr. John Willen, former president of our organization. He has raised his hand. I think you have a question.
Well, a comment question. Would not the guy who would, since you know a lot about the Shenandoah, who actually was responsible for procuring that ship for the Confederacy, would be James Bullock, the uncle of Theodore Roosevelt, and other raiders as well, I suppose.
Yes, and
but he must have been involved with the Shenandoah, right?
Yes, the man who bought the ship was James Dunwoody Bullock, and one of his sons served on the Shenandoah as an officer. So there's a lot of family connection there. The grandson of James Dunwoody Bullock moved to Perth, Western Australia, and also at some stage down the track, one of the CSS Alabama's flags was found in Hobart, Tasmania. How it got there, where it wound up, goodness knows. But it was one of those freaks of nature that is so difficult to try to investigate.
That I never knew, but it's the reason probably that Roosevelt got so interested in naval affairs and wrote about it and everything. It's because of his uncle.
If anybody else would like to ask any questions, feel free to open your mic and you can go ahead and ask those. All right, well then, while someone is thinking, I'll take the floor again. And 27 bookshelves. What is your favorite book on your collection?
When I was 6 years old, we went into one of Melbourne's bookshops. My mother bought me a copy of a Bruce Catton book, which was when I began getting interested. My grandfather went on a tour around the world by ship, came back with a book that he bought in San Francisco for $5 American, and it was the Bruce Catton Centennial, Bruce Catton American Heritage book on the Civil War. And then 3 or 4 years after that, about 67, 68, my parents thought very deeply, very hard, and paid $27, which was probably a day's pay in those days, to buy me the 3-volume Bruce Catton Centennial History of the Civil War. So he was the first person that I really read and understood a lot of the Civil War. My first trip to America in 1977, when I went to the Civil War Roundtable Congress in Jackson, Mississippi, and with Ed Barrs standing on the bluffs at Vicksburg, I was introduced and met E.B. Pete Long, who was Bruce Catton's researcher. And I went up and shook his hand and said, "You've no idea of how much I realize I am in awe of the work that Bruce Catton did." And about 3 months ago, on a buying spree, I bought an autograph of Carl Sandburg, Douglas Southall Freeman, and Bruce Catton, the 3 Pulitzer Prize winners of Civil War books. So they're a part of my collection now.
That's wonderful. I was wondering if you had Bruce Catton's signature, because they are not easy to come by. Well, good for you.
In the year 2007, the United States Postal Service decided that they would no longer send surface mail to Australia, so it was no longer financially feasible to buy books in America and then pay another $10 per book to get them shipped. In the days before that, I could buy a sack full of mail and pay $20 for maybe 15, 20 books on the Civil War from one of the secondhand bookshops in America. So in 2007, it was no longer feasible, and I began buying a lot of Kindle books. So I've got about 5,000 Civil War paperbacks and hardbacks, and about 4,000 Kindle books now. And of course, the problem with the Kindle books is that they have no value, no autographs, no resale value, but they are the thing that keeps my shelves empty.
I was going to say, you don't need to build new bookshelves or put a new room on your house. John, I see you raised your hand again. Did you want to ask another question? You're on mute.
Yeah, Barry, speaking from someone who is not from the U.S., what maybe to someone here or maybe someone else in a different country who's interested in the Civil War, what books would you recommend to really get and keep their attention?
Hard to say, because there is such a wide variety. I was doing work yesterday on Civil War balloons, and women in the Civil War navies, James McPherson, Shelby Foote. People keep on writing books. Every new week another book comes out, and whether it's a biography of a general, a biography of a politician, soldiers' diaries and memoirs, they all have their usefulnesses also. I'm surprised that the language of the Civil War and how it's changed from then until now. From what I've been understanding, back in those days, they said the word lieutenant, and in the early 1900s, it changed from lieutenant to lieutenant. So all the Civil War movies that we see nowadays, they say the wrong word.
Thank you, John, and thank you for asking that question. From John Chamberlain, he has asked you your opinion on the book, The Fatal Shore.
It's surprising. There is a lot of interest between America and Australia from World War One, World War Two. We've been allies of America for the last 100 years or so, and as much as we have different from each other, we drive the different sides of the road. We speak a slightly different language. We have different interests or so, but there is still a lot of usefulness between having our friends. I've been able to travel around America to visit the battlefields and go to the museums and libraries and attend Civil War meetings. And I've been so in awe of the friendships, the hospitality, the comradeship that Americans have treated me or so. And I'm sure that we've tried to reciprocate when Americans come and visit Australia, and we are given the opportunity to say thank you for all of the good that they do to us and for us.
Barry, it has been an absolute pleasure, an honor, and a privilege to have you join us. Our first Down Under, our first international presenter. This has been great. Thank you for filling in. And Mick, thank you very much for reaching out to Barry to do this presentation. What a wonderful presentation. If folks have more questions, we can always get them out to Barry. Just send them to us or to him directly. Thank you again. A big round of applause again for Barry Crompton. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.